Welcome to the podcast series at the College of Education and Integrated Studies. My name is Jeff Pass. I'm the Dean of the College, and we have as our guest today Dr. Rebecca Kennedy de Lorenzini, who is a professor in our Department of Interdisciplinary General Education. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dean Pass. Thank you so much for having me.
Rebecca, we have to start off because some people may not know what interdisciplinary general education is at Cal Poly Pomona. Can you tell us a few things about it?
Sure. So we call interdisciplinary general education IGE for short. And IGE is an alternative path to complete the general education requirements in the university. And we're a really unique department. We have this sequence of courses that students complete from their first to third year, or sometimes first through fourth year. And they follow our sequence of courses, which are all interdisciplinary, and they, through their studies, complete most of the general education courses, but also get to be part of this smaller, a relatively smaller cohort. There's a strong sense of community in the department because of this. The students get to really know each other. They really get to know us, the faculty and the staff, and of course we get to know them. And we really embrace an interdisciplinary approach to the general education requirements at the university. So we fold in a lot of different methods and ask questions according to different disciplinary fields.
So when you say interdisciplinary, what does that mean? Can you give me an example from one of your courses, perhaps, to illustrate how it would be interdisciplinary as opposed to a more traditional kind of general education approach?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, our faculty is interdisciplinary in our training. So we bring that into the classroom, and we also engage in co-teaching. We have courses where I'm a trained historian and my colleague, Kenneth Stahl, for instance, is trained in literature and English specifically, and Hillary Hawkinson is trained as an art historian. So we'll co-teach a course, and last semester in spring of 2020, Dr. Hawkinson and I taught a course, IGE 2200, and it's called Encountering Difference, Culture, and Power. And it's a course that really looks at how we define the other in society, how we mark difference, and then how we work to bridge differences. And in communities, we spend a lot of time talking about the Los Angeles community and how this works locally, but we also look at how it has worked historically. So I'll bring in texts and ask historical questions about the legacies of colonialism and imperialism and how that has marked difference across time. And to help students access that information and process and understand that information in a different way, which we think is more holistic. For instance, Dr. Hawkinson will bring in a painting or photography and will analyze that as a primary source. And she brings all of her tools from art history to help the students access that painting. So for instance, we were discussing Orientalism, and we read Edward Said's famous text called Orientalism. And Dr. Hawkinson led us through a close analysis of The Snake Charmer, which is a painting that's on the cover of Edward Said's book. And just her depth of expertise really helps us go further than I would alone in my history class. I very well might bring in a painting. I have before. I've used interdisciplinarity often in my classes. But it's not the same as having Dr. Hawkinson help me with that and help our students with that and help guide us when we're talking specifically about art history.
So it's a much richer experience as a result of this collaboration and interdisciplinary, because students can see things through multiple lenses.
That's right. That's right. And I think it also really helps their critical thinking skills because they get sort of the meta view of what they're doing, that the questions they're asking come from a disciplinary tradition. And because of that, they're not automatic, they're not inevitable. These are approaches that we train in. And so when we break out of the discipline and model for them and talk them through, okay, now we're going to use an ethnographic approach, and how does that change the questions we're asking about a text or about an historical phenomenon or a current event? I think that really expands their minds to see there's so many different ways to think about this. And I can be intentional about the questions that I form, and of course it expands their toolbox, as we've mentioned. Additionally, because we don't have any majors, our students are coming from other majors. They're interdisciplinary themselves, and they bring so much to our classroom with their own expertise that they have. We have a lot of architecture students and engineering students, liberal studies students, education students. We have students who are studying hospitality. Across the university, we have students come from all of the different colleges and majors, and they bring their own perspectives. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for us to use the interdisciplinary approach to really highlight and celebrate their strengths and their expertise.
So in some ways, it sounds like you're changing the balance of power in the classroom, in that it's not the sage on the stage, the teacher, the professor who knows everything and is imparting knowledge, but instead it's calling on all of these varied individuals, very diverse, to contribute their perspectives and really construct their own knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. That is at the core of what we do. IGE has smaller classes. We have 20, 30 students on average, I'd say. And in those classes, we're discussion and project based for the most part. So the professor is not at the front of the room lecturing to the students. We are not imparting knowledge on them. We are all part of the knowledge production process, and we're all learning together. And in IGE, the faculty really see themselves as guides and as discussion leaders, and will help kind of move the discussion or the project or the activity in a certain direction and make sure that we're accomplishing our learning outcomes. But the students are just as much a part of that. They are central to that. They lead discussion. They take us to places because of their expertise and individual perspectives that we couldn't have guessed.
So you have a lot of spontaneity. How do students react to this? For many of them, it must be quite a change from the traditional model.
Yes, it is. And I would say one of the benefits of having a sequence, a path, where they're in it for several semesters, several years, they have lots of time to get used to it, to learn about the benefits of it. They have so much opportunity to become comfortable in IGE. And I would say most become comfortable very quickly, but it's not like they just have one semester, one course. There's so much opportunity to build on their skills, and we intentionally scaffold the courses so that they are building on their skills. But students quite often want to know what they should know. They want to know at the end of a class what they should be taking away from it. And we try to give them that, but we also try to really underscore that this is their educational journey. And for them to really value that and really lean into that, which means taking some risks. It means having the conversation go in a different way because a student brought up a really fascinating point and the others really want to talk about that. And that means that we're going off of the strict lesson plan for a little bit, because we know that inevitably happens pretty much every class. But having the students being willing to relax and go with that journey and be surprised by it and see where we end up means that they can really engage their critical thinking and analysis skills in a way that isn't so focused on what content are we specifically trying to learn today. It's more, how are we going to expand our thinking today, and how are we going to change our perspectives today, and how are we going to learn how to ask new questions and approach materials in new ways. So that takes an adjustment.
Right.
That takes, yeah.
And I think it must take an adjustment on faculty's part also to let things flow instead of trying to control every aspect of a conversation. But I'm guessing that gives you great opportunities to bring in current issues and events that tie in with the themes that you're teaching.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we in that class that I mentioned, IGE 2200, that I co-taught with Dr. Hawkinson, we talked a lot about homelessness in Southern California. And that is an historical issue, but it's also a very current issue, obviously. So that's just one example of a current issue that we discussed. I'm currently teaching an upper division synthesis course 3600, which is UFOs, Illuminati, and other conspiracy theories. And there's been such a burgeoning of conspiracy theories in the past couple of decades that, and this moment with QAnon, and just this past week, there was an NPR radio program on conspiracy theories with the wildfires in Oregon. So we have so much current material that we can bring in. And ultimately, that adds, I think, some relevance to the students. They can apply it to their lives. Toward the end of the semester, we're going to be discussing conspiracy theories around the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's very real for the students. They're living this. So I think that that's very impactful.
The COVID-19 conspiracies, what is your goal in teaching a topic like that? What do you want the students to come away with?
Ultimately, we want them to feel empowered, that they can read information, read the news, read sources, and feel that they can interpret them, that they can make decisions in their lives about what they will believe, what they'll follow, and how they'll act accordingly. Of course, one of our learning outcomes is the articulation of values. That's really important to us. So we want students to reflect on how they carry their values into the world and interact with these, well, exceedingly crazy and difficult, challenging times that we're in right now, where, quite frankly, we can feel powerless. We can feel like there's a complete loss of control, and to have students feel empowered, like they have a few more tools to navigate that's in line with their values, I think would be really great. Another thing that's useful about bringing current events is that we're paying close attention in this class to how narratives are constructed, to what is so appealing about conspiracy theories, how they're presented, what sorts of arguments they make, what sorts of evidence is used to support them, and fundamentally, why are people so drawn to them? And there is historicity there to that question, that this conspiracy theories are not new, of course, so we're tracking through time patterns. And I think for students to see how they live today is actually part of a larger pattern, that there is a historical tradition here of presenting information in this way, and to see how we're a part of that can be helpful as well.
So you're adding historical perspective to current issues.
Yes.
And that not only develops deeper insight into the issues, but it helps students value history and know that whenever something else comes along, there's probably an historic antecedent that we should be studying and looking for patterns.
Yes, absolutely. And that's part of my approach to history. And it's how in the department we often think about histories in terms of patterns and processes, continuities, and also change over time. And I tell the students, we're not making you memorize dates and names, and you won't have a multiple choice test on, facts from the past. That's not the goal. We're really looking at these larger patterns and larger processes and trying to understand them in a way that helps students understand the current world that we're living in, that we're all navigating as best we can.
So you mentioned that there's a sequence of courses. How many courses are they? Are they all freshman to sophomore, or do they extend across the 4 years?
So there's the 1,000 level courses, which is IGE 1100 and 1200 are completed in the first year, typically.
That's taken by freshmen.
Yep, that's taken by freshmen. Sophomores take 2100 and 2200. And then sophomores can double up and also take 2300 and 2400, so that you can then complete the capstone course in your third year, or you can spread that out over 4 years and complete the capstone course in the fourth year. So it is a 3 to 4 year program. In general, 1100 and 1200 will be taken by freshmen, but depending on the individual student's path, sometimes we have sophomores, sometimes we have others. If they would like to double up on courses, we can speak to them about that. So it's not a strict rule that only freshmen can take the 11 and 1200. That's not the case.
So I want the potential students to know, if they're taking the sequence of courses from IGE, from Interdisciplinary General Education, what courses are they not taking in the traditional model?
I know that we satisfy A requirements and C requirements. So those are oral and written communication general education classes, as well as the humanities. We also satisfy the social sciences, especially the D general education requirements, which are in our upper division synthesis courses, which actually is another set of courses that I haven't spoken too much about, but that any student at the university can take. They're not part of the sequence. Quite often, sequence students will complete the sequence and also take an upper division synthesis course.
Right. But the point is that because they're taking the IGE courses, they're not taking other courses. So it's not like it's an additive process. It's just
No,
the same 120 hours.
that's absolutely right. No, I do know that they will complete most of the GEs they need to complete. There are very few that IGE doesn't.
Right. So let's talk about you and how did you become an interdisciplinary scholar? What was the turning point for you?
Well, there was actually a moment. I'll say in general, I've always loved English classes and history classes and language classes. I've been a student of French and Spanish, and I'm just beginning Italian. But I think that those are connected. I've always loved studying the humanities. And I was a history major in college, and then I turned to an interdisciplinary field for a master's degree, which was Latin American studies. And that was because I really wanted to study Latin America. I wanted to study the history of it, but I wanted to study Spanish and Portuguese. I wanted to be able to take some political science or geography courses. So I really liked the interdisciplinary approach. And at the end of that master's program, I knew I had to continue. I had too many questions that I wanted to follow. I felt like I had much more learning to do, so I wanted to go on to a PhD program. And I went to one of my mentors, who's an historian, and I said, I really can't decide between going into a history PhD program or at that time a Spanish and Portuguese program. And he said to me, well, do you want to teach History 101 or Spanish 101? And I thought that was a good question because it made me think about, at the end of the day, what's kind of the bread and butter of that discipline, right? What's at the core of that discipline? And I really couldn't decide. So I took 3 years off, actually. And I have always been drawn to teaching. So I was teaching for those 3 years. I was teaching Spanish and really thinking about that whole 3 years. And I came to the conclusion that I have to do both, that I can't just completely abandon one or the other. And I ended up choosing to do a history PhD. But my dissertation is very much an interdisciplinary dissertation. I have always gone kind of first, I use archival materials and primary sources in that way, but I really use literature as a primary source in my research. I'm very drawn to poetry and historical novels and theater and artwork sometimes as well, as a source. And so because of that, I always bring in literary criticism, literary theory to help me analyze these primary sources of literature in an historical context. So I've always done interdisciplinary work. And then I've been fortunate enough to be able to stay in interdisciplinary departments. After graduating with my PhD, I went into a history and literature program, which is an interdisciplinary department. And then when I saw this job opening for interdisciplinary education, I got so excited. It's an interdisciplinary department. I can freely embrace interdisciplinary approaches, which is something that many scholars do in their home departments. I'm sure there are many historians at Cal Poly Pomona who are using other approaches. There's so much value in how other fields are approaching our historical content that I think many have taken on these approaches. But to be able to spend the majority of my time actively doing interdisciplinary work is really exciting for me. And IGE creates a home for that and bring it into the teaching.
Right. Did you encounter any resistance to interdisciplinary approaches through your training and your career?
No, I don't think I've encountered any direct resistance. When I've encountered resistance, it's been more to my transnational approaches because I'm a transnational historian.
You better define transnational.
Transnational, yes. So the history of movement of ideas, people, commodities across international borders. These are the kinds of processes that transnational historians are interested in. So that's a little different from, let's say, an international historian or an historian who's doing comparative studies, let's say, who might write a history that's comparing systems of slavery in the US and Brazil, for instance. That would be a comparative history. But I study transnational history, so I'm more interested in the movement of ideas and people between the US and Brazil. For instance, folks who are crossing borders that we as historians have set up that define nation states and even temporal boundaries, time periods that align with certain moments in a given nation's history when we're watching people kind of cross borders. That can really shift. So, for instance, I'm a cultural historian of the Americas, and as such, I look at the African diaspora and diasporic processes in the Americas. And when we do that, the typical markers in U.S. history, such as, let's say, 1877, moving from Reconstruction into the Jim Crow era. If we're looking at enslaved peoples in Brazil, or actually I'll say the Caribbean, let's say in Cuba, there's been a long history of exchange between Cuba and the United States. But slavery wasn't abolished in Cuba at the same time that was abolished in the United States. So we understand systems of slavery and when we look at how individuals move, even en masse, then that enslaved condition changes and shifts so that freedom is understood in different ways when, let's say, they come to the US and are no longer enslaved, but then have other restrictions on their freedom placed on them that maybe didn't exist in Cuba. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much with this, but I've had some resistance, let's say, where I'm writing my book project is actually focused more on the 20th century. And when I look at intellectual history from Latin America that is part of exchange with the United States, I've had some scholars say, I don't see how that's US history, for instance. And that's the resistance that I've come up again. And then I have the burden of proving why this is central to the story of the US, as opposed to the story of Cuba or Brazil or Colombia, which is actually the country that I focus on the most when looking at exchange between the US and Latin America.
So in a sense, you're breaking down intellectual borders as you're tracking the changes over national borders.
Yes, that's the idea. And this is part of, there's a transnational turn that's been going for a while, especially in the early 2000s. It really got going. And so there's a lot of scholarship out there now that does that, but we still can find resistance, right, to those who want to define U.S. history in strict terms.
Yeah. So you mentioned COVID a little bit earlier, and I'd be remiss not to talk about what kinds of adjustments have you made as a professor in your teaching to respond to the remote learning? Have there been things that were new opportunities for you?
Yes, absolutely. I would say the first thing I did was try to get together with my colleagues in the department and kind of take stock of how our students were doing, how the faculty is doing, to see kind of what the landscape is of what's going on in class and outside of class. And of course, it wasn't difficult to assess that it was an absolute crisis, especially last spring when we moved to online learning. So the first shift was just getting our skills regarding virtual learning ready for the shift. So I spent some time getting more familiar with Zoom. I was really fortunate that I had already taught with Zoom before, so I was pretty comfortable with the platform. But since this shift, I've learned so much about Zoom and all of the tools that it has. And Zoom itself has changed to meet the demand that the educational system needs because of this crisis. And so last spring was a lot of sort of crisis mitigation and one adjustment I made was I had to spend some real time really reevaluating what I was doing in each class and how it was working towards our IGE learning outcomes. And all the other goals that I might have for that material or that class on that day, I really had to put aside and say, we need to accomplish our learning outcomes by the end of the semester. And we need to stay really focused on that. We can't get distracted by other things. Also putting front and center the health and well-being of our students, right? So I did constant check-ins with the students to see how they're doing, and tried to adjust the lesson plans accordingly, always keeping in mind what are the learning outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And then I thought, with the fall starting, we will have had the summer to recoup, and we'll be able to start from fresh, and students will be used to this. And that is somewhat the case. I mean, that is the case. It has been easier, I think, all around, but we're still in a crisis. Of course, we're still in a pandemic. There is still individual and collective loss and grief that students are feeling. I've had students in my Zoom calls evacuating from the wildfires, literally driving away from their homes, and they're in my class on Zoom, which I applaud the dedication, but that's amazing to me. I mean, and it does speak to our students' dedication, how seriously they take our classes and their education. But I think their priority, of course, they need to take care of themselves and make sure that they are safe and that their families and loved ones are safe first. And then I hope that their education and that my class and all of their classes can be a strengthening place, a place where they feel supported, a place where they can pull added resources for themselves as they live through this crisis. And also, to help with that, I went to a few of Victoria Bavsar's workshops and Zoom sessions, which were incredibly helpful.
This is the Center for Academic.
That's right, CAFE. Yeah,
Right.
and I also last spring attended a CSU workshop on Zoom called Coping and Caring: How to Become a Mental Health Ally. Because, of course, these stressful moments really compound, I think, or can exacerbate or amplify mental health issues, or start new ones, of course. And I really care a lot about mental health initiatives on campus and in the CSU system. So this was led by a group of professors from CSU Long Beach, and it was really wonderful. I learned a lot of tools about how to help identify students in distress, and then help point them to resources that might help them. And then additionally, there's a wonderful document that Vanderbilt University published called Teaching in Times of Crisis. And in there are some strategies that I've found really helpful in my class. Taking time to discuss the pandemic, to give students an opportunity to express what's happening to them in real time is really important, especially since these are traumatic events, or potentially so. They're difficult, and it's important we give space to process and articulate what's happening. And then also, that document suggests being mindful of the cognitive load of the students, which is going to be less than in, let's say, a regular semester, right? A typical semester that we've experienced before this pandemic. So I took that very seriously. And that was part of my readjusting the syllabus and my goals for each class, and trying to stay close to the learning outcomes and not overload the cognitive load. Another adjustment is I found that things take longer on Zoom. Just everything. It's not like I can, in the classroom on campus, I would pass out a worksheet. We could dive right into it immediately. It takes longer to download a worksheet or to go to Blackboard and find it. Or even if they find it ahead of time, we'll do small or large group discussions in class, and everybody comes together on the worksheet. All of that takes more time virtually.
Any student who's in IGE would benefit from getting the kinds of curriculum and instructional methods and tender loving care that you and the other professors are providing across our college. And I'm hoping if anybody's watching it and considering enrolling in any IGE courses, whether it's freshmen or sophomores or juniors, they'll take that opportunity, because they've gotten a nice little window into how it works from our interview today. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And if anyone has any questions about IGE, come find us. We're on the Cal Poly Pomona website. All of the faculty and staff would be delighted to chat with you. So please contact us. We're there for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.